Hello and welcome to this presentation on Burgundy 2021, a trying vintage to say the least. I'm Christy Canterbury. I'm a master of wine based in New York City. Today I'm in my London studio. I'm over here judging some wine competitions, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you about what we know so far about this very unusual vintage. And to sum it up in the winemaker's words, a couple of thoughts from them. And SYLVIE ESMONIN of her eponymous domain in GEVREY-CHAMBERTIN comes first. She said, "There was little wine and far too much work. There was nothing but rain, and September was the prettiest month of summer." Sarcasm noted. Sylvie Poyot, the general director of Domaine de la Bougerie, called it the year of the sorting table. And of course, there are different kinds of sorting tables, and you might see some, not that many domains in Burgundy sorting just in the vineyard, or they might sort some in the vineyard and then come and sort again at their processing facility. So you might see the kind of the rolling tables that carry the grapes along with people on either side picking out grapes and leaves and stems. But Christophe Perrault-Minot of Domaine Perrault-Minot and Maurice Saint-Denis was an optical sorter. And he said that it feels easier to overcome, his word, a vintage like 2021 when there's a machine like that that's so precise that it puts out what he calls caviar for his team to vinify. And granted, not many people have Christophe's optical sorting tables. There are a lot more of those in Bordeaux than in Burgundy. And after an easy 2020, Pierre-Yves Collin-Moret called it nice, comfortable, and Denis Bachelet in GEVREY-CHAMBERTIN called it exceptional. Winemakers could sleep in 2020. 21 wreaked havoc on Burgundy, the winemakers, the vines, and we'll see, the wines possibly as well. Loic Dugas-Py went on to say that 2021 was more like a year from the 1980s, with lots of rain and temperatures hardly ever reaching 30 C or about 86 degrees Fahrenheit, even in the peak of summer. So I have a lot of charts with discs and bars and other things to kind of illustrate what was happening during the 2021 vintage. And here we can see on the vertical axis we've got temperatures, and the horizontal axis is precipitation, and the size of the discs there in the center is the amount of the cumulative amount of sunshine during the vintage. And 2021 is almost at the center of the axis, and so that seems good because that is what's normal, which is quite interesting. What is normal? And so what are the other discs that are just around it? If you go just to the right, you see 2004, that gold colored disc. Is 2001 going to produce wines that taste like 2004? I don't think so, but we'll have to wait and see. But if we didn't know anything about Burgundy in general, we might think of maybe looking at the extremes and thinking, ooh, maybe those aren't good. So if we took the 2010, and it's really quite low on the temperature scale, surprisingly so compared to the rest of the vintages here, really quite small in terms of sunshine received, and middling in terms of precipitation. We might think, maybe not such a great vintage. But 2010 produced certainly glorious whites and fantastic reds as well. Let's look at some other vintages that are in very different places. Here is this blue disc here. That's 2016. When I was in Burgundy in September and December of last year to write my 2020 Burgundy special report, I was surprised at how many winemakers were telling me that they were drinking their 2016s already, just a vintage of great pleasure. Certainly age-worthy as well, but just so juicy and delectable right now. So unusual for them not to be talking about vintages that are 10, 15, 20 years behind, but they're really starting to enjoy that vintage. So lovely vintage, especially the reds. Let's come over here. 2015, excellent, especially for the reds again. Wow, look at that. Lots of sunshine, lots of high temperatures, not much precipitation. So you could go through and parse out all of these elements of these different years and say, well, oh yes, I don't like that vintage, or I do like that vintage. But you can see that when you look at them from the perspective of these three aspects, you really have great vintages and less great vintages turning up all over on this meteorologic comparison. So the struggles of the 2021 vintage began at the very start with a warmer than usual in January, except for the Yonne department where Chablis is based, and February. And the problem with warmer winters is that they kickstart the vine growing season. Sap starts to push, buds begin to form, and inevitably, a couple of weeks, months down the road, when there are freezing temperatures again, the frost kills those buds and then reduces the crop. And as an aside, I put on a seminar with Christian Moreau a couple of weeks ago in Manhattan, and he told me that they had frost. He remembers them having frost on May the 29th in 1961. So very extreme, it seems. But at the same time, in 2021, there were 4 episodes of sleet in Chablis. We'll see this in the next chart. In May, and the last one was on May the 24th. So truly a continental climate there to torture the vigneron, even today with climate change in effect. So in 2021, with back to temperatures, the night of April the 5th into the 6th was catastrophic. And then it was followed by sub-zero temperatures, frost, and snow. And the BIVB, who is the professional sales and marketing machine of Burgundy, recorded that temperatures fell as low as -8°C, which is basically 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was even as far south as Puy-Fouissé. So this was particularly damaging, not only because it was just really cold, but it had followed 10 days of really warm temperatures. And the Chardonnay was particularly hard hit because Chardonnay is the first variety to bud and is more, so call it, precocious. Almost always, other than Pinot Noir and the Yonne, which they tend to be a little bit more tracking side by side. So with regard to temperatures, some warmth returned in June, as you can see on the chart here, but then July and August were cool again. And the temperatures were just a yo-yo all year long. And so then there was rain and lots of it. And here we have the percentage differences from average precipitation. Denis Bachelet said that on June the 9th, there was a tremendous rainstorm with hail in GEVREY-CHAMBERTIN, and I saw some ridiculous videos of his vineyards where there were basically rivers rushing through the vines. There was about 30 centimeters or 12 inches of water that had nowhere to go. And while May and January had been pretty generous in terms of precipitation, there was a bit of a deficit February, March, April, but there was room for precipitation to be absorbed in the vines, but not all at once. And the runoff was so dramatic that many vignerons were back in the vineyards days later trying to bring soil back up to the top of the vines because there had just been so much washed away. So then later in June, the 19th and the 21st, the Côte Chalonnaise and the Mâconnais saw some significant hail as well. And in July, it rained and rained and rained. It rained daily, save between the 17th and the 22nd. So by now, diseases are running rampant in the vines, and some producers reported both powdery and downy mildew, which is extremely rare. You usually have the conditions for just one or the other. But this was just another perfect example that in 2021, everything was possible. And then again, in early August, the rain continued, but luckily this was soon followed by some cool northerly winds and warmer weather that helped to dry out the vineyards a bit. Because of the rain and so much of it during the growing season, Xavier Oriot of Domaine Launay Oriot in Pommard, based in Pommard, commented that it was very difficult to stay certified for organic viticulture. And while Xavier stuck with it, many decided to leave the qualification, including domains like Dren-la-Rose in GEVREY-CHAMBERTIN, even with all of their many phenomenal Grand Cru vineyards. Of course, they'll just reapply and take the 3-year process to get back into the certification, but it's a big decision to make in order to say, here we go, we're exiting, and then we're going to have to go back through the certification process. So anyway, in the end, the rain does need to be put in perspective just a bit. Well, it felt like a lot, and it certainly was a lot after the recent more dry to super, super dry years. The quantities were still slightly lower than average. So I'm going to bring up my very favorite chart one more time just to point out exactly where we are in 2021, that big red circle in the center of the chart. So just slightly lower than average. It just shows you how dramatic that is. Some of the vintages that we've been seeing more recently are in terms of how little precipitation is being received. So again, just a reminder very quickly here, because what we need to talk about is what happens on the next chart. Because here we see the problems are during the growing season, the timing of the precipitation, largely May through July, when the vines are in their most critical phases of development. And just going back to the mentality of the vigneron Etienne of Domaine Joseph Wayot in Volnay, so that they had everything except hail. Côte de Beaune was unusually spared in 2021. He had botrytis and desiccation. So he was super grateful that he had that kind of August and those 3 weeks or so of really good weather going into the harvest that really helped to save the vintage. And of course, that just reminds me of SYLVIE ESMONIN's, September was the best month of summer. So here we have the percentage differences from average sunshine. And Jean-Philippe Fichet, whose domain is based in Meursault, really emphasized this point that it's important not to forget that sunshine is incredibly important as a ripening conductor. Especially Pinot Noir prefers sunshine, not so much heat. So that was really important. And overall, the Côte d'Or and the Côte Chalonnaise Mâconnais were up 6% and 8% respectively over the normal. So there was a good amount of sunshine. And Chablis was only down 4%. So sunshine was relatively good. And we saw that certainly with comparisons to 2010, 2016, 2004, there was definitely more sunshine in 2012. So harvest. Harvest began in mid-September for the Crémants and certainly the more advanced plots. In Chablis, the brow furrowed producers that I saw in September said that they were likely to start on the 20th or the 21st, depending on the rain showers. And the week before they were going to start harvesting, it was the Wednesday. Lots of people wanted to start on kind of Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. There was in the evening an absolute torrential downpour. So was it rehydration or dilution? Most producers actually felt that while it was very dramatic, that there wasn't enough to truly affect the quality of the wines. Like in 2020, the typical harvesting orders were thrown out the window due to weather, disease, frost that had reduced the yield so much on some vines that they ripened more quickly. So winemakers were just constantly running around in the vineyards, taking sugar samples, looking at total acidities, all those kinds of things, trying to figure out which order to harvest in this year. So harvest started in mid-September, and the last clusters were coming in October. Incredibly for the still wines, especially a lot of people were actually starting to harvest in 2021 later, a month later than they started in 2020, which of course was the earliest season ever. So, the real question, what will the 2021 Burgundies be like? The early season stress on the Chardonnay, especially, resulted in relatively low sugar levels. Pinot Noir fared better, but it's still on the lower end of the spectrum. That's going to stand in great contrast to recent vintages. But then again, Burgundy and Pinot Noir coming from Grand Crus achieving 60% alcohol is not a good thing, which we certainly saw in 19. The 2020s of all colors look like they're going to be perfectly respectable in terms of their ABVs, somewhere over 12, just over 12, going up to 13.5. So while the sugar levels seem relatively low, the wines are actually really quite normal, quite classic alcohol levels for Burgundy. Acidities are going to be high across the board. Whole cluster use on Pinot Noir in 2021 is much rarer because the stems simply were still green, or not at least as lignified as most winemakers would have wanted them. SYLVIE Poyot, again from Vougeray, said that many cuvées were whole cluster, 100% whole cluster in 2020. It was the exact opposite case in 2021. And again, Christophe Perrault said that as opposed to his usual 50 to 60%, especially on the top wines, whole cluster use, he often was using only 5 to 10% in 2021. And one of those funny things about stem use is that when you use stems, you decrease your acidity and you lighten your colors. So we know that the 2021s likely will be a little darker for this and higher in acidity. So small quantities, but that will be the case. Now, on the latter note, due to the small berries, small yields, reds have anthocyanin or color levels that are between the 2015 and 2020 vintages. And I will tell you that the 2020s are dark. Many of them look like Syrah. And that is simply because there was a lot of color to extract from that sunny, really dry year. So they're very dark. So to know that 2021, such a different year in style, in weather patterns, is going to be that dark is fascinating. 2015 and 2020 are the two highest years of color quantities since 2000, so over the last 21 years. In addition to this, tannin levels stand slightly higher than 1999's. Very interesting. High acid, high tannin. And this makes 2021 the fifth highest tannin level since 1999. So that is definitely going to be interesting to experience, and lots of things can be done in aging, in blending, because we're going to talk about that in a moment. So that could be managed in the cellar, but we'll have to see what they do. Some producers called this a return to classic years. Of course, classic has a bit of an ambiguous connotation these days. Does that mean it's a restaurant vintage? Does it mean it's a good vintage? What does that mean? People say it with different intentions. But there is absolutely no question that the greatly improved technical acumen in both the vineyard and the winery will help the vintage more than in previously normal years. And so for now, we'll have to wait to see what ends up in our glasses. And speaking of which, I have this glass specifically because this is a Sidonios glass. And Thibault Liger-Belair, who has his domain in Nuits Saint-Georges, expects that he's going to use his Sidonios glasses for his 2021s to give them a rounder feeling. And meanwhile, he uses his Zalto, so more kind of more angular for his 2019s to kind of give them some more strictness, some more better posture, if you will. So something to think about. There are so many moves to universal glasses, but not everyone is doing that, it seems. Okay, so availability of the 2021 wines. Well, we'll see how much we can get our hands on. Hervé Tucky, who was formerly of La Chablisienne for 35 years, he classified the losses in all the quality ranks, not just the Grand Crus, the Premier Crus, but Petit Chablis, Chablis, everything, for about 60 to 80%. Michel Coutu at Domaine Michel Nilon and Chassagne-Montrachet racked up losses of 70% in his Premier Crus. Pierre Durocher of Domaine Durocher and Gevrey said he was also down across the entire domain, so from Bourgogne Rouge to his Grand Crus. And Marie-André Munuret at Domaine Munuret-Gibourg in Vaune said that 2021 is the smallest vintage that she and her sister have ever made. And so that's just the 21, but now to give you a little bit of kind of continuity and perspective that some of these domains are experiencing. Alexandre Abel at Domaine, the winemaker now at Domaine Ponceau, said their harvest quantities have been going down consistently since 2017 and 18, which were both down more or less 35%. In 2019, the domain was down 40%. In 2020 and 21, respectively, the domain lost 50 and 70% of its harvest. So certainly what is a normal harvest, those ideas need to be being adjusted. But if you are looking at going back 20, 30 years, everyone measures it slightly differently. These are tremendous losses. And to put that in, take it out of percentages and put it in more of a concrete term, Denis Bachelet usually makes 8 barrels of Charme-Chambertin Grand Cru. He made 3 in 2021. Worse, at least volume-wise, Loïc Dugapi usually makes 30 barrels of Bourgogne Rouge. He made 3. So it really has affected the entire quality spectrum, the weather, the climactic accidents, as the French like to call them. Frédéric Barnier, who is a winemaker at Bouchard-Perry-Fils, so enormous winery, négociant, of course, owns many vineyards as well, an astonishing number of vineyards, says that for 2021, he is on allocation for every single cuvée, including Bourgogne Rouge and Bourgogne Blanc. So the only person that was relatively pleased by his yields was Clos-de-Tar's Alessandro Noli. He harvested almost 30% more in 2021 because in June 2019, after everyone had forgotten about the harsh frosts, there was an oversupply of the candles in the vineyards, so he purchased them all. and that allowed him to double the number of candles in his incredible monopole vineyard during April 2021's horrifyingly bitter nights. So I mentioned blending a little while ago. So we have much smaller quantities. It's harder to make smaller quantities of wine than larger quantities of wine. But also sometimes it just doesn't make any sense to have just a couple cases or, a barrel of one wine to commercialize. That there's a lot of time and cost and labor that go into that. And so Sylvie Poyot back at Vougeray, she has custom-made fermentation barrels for each of her vineyards. But in 2021, she had to combine many of them just to ferment them because it made no sense to have tiny, tiny quantities of liquid in these fermentation vessels. Also, something to keep an eye out for, some winemakers blended their Premier Crus with village wines, and of course, even some of the really tiny bits of Grand Crus got blended into Premier Crus. So it's going to be good year to know about those nuances, because you might be able to tease out a little bit of extra value in what are going to be extremely expensive wines, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. So another thing that's happening in the market is that many negociants are thinking of purchasing less wine. Even negociant wines are becoming more expensive, especially when the years are short in quantities. That makes them harder to sell. Negociant wines are supposed to be kind of more of the value wines, often, not necessarily if you're talking about Philippe Paquelet or some others, but they're certainly often supposed to be provide a little more value. So that's not good for their business plan. It's also not great for their quality when maybe they're searching all over. They don't know the grower, they don't know the vines, and of course reputation is everything. It's very easy to lose that, and then it's hard to rebuild. So on the surface, the story of the 2021 weather might keep some people away. However, with demand at ever rising highs, this tiny vintage is going to sell out extremely quickly, whatever the prices are asked. Jean-Charles Thomas and Bruno Pepin at Louis Latour think it's going to take 3 years to get out of this cycle. Let's see if I can get that to come up. So 2021, there's not much. It's going to sell quickly. 2022, the prices aren't going to fall after the 2021 vintage, regardless of how voluminous or not 2022 is. 2023, the prices won't be more than 2020 if volumes hold at good levels. And 2024, which of course will be sold in 2025, if the harvest is again normal, things should start to even out, maybe even provide a correction. So that sounds like there could be a light at the end of the tunnel, but I will tell you that normal is certainly relative, and obviously Louis Latour is a very large house, and has just a huge number of labels, so their losses tend to be spread out quite differently. But in 2021, we're affected everywhere like everyone else. But many producers say they haven't had a full vintage in over a decade, or a normal vintage in over a decade, even though 2018 certainly filled the cellars and was an exceedingly generous vintage in volume by current day standards. So we'll see about how prices do. And all of this plus Burgundy sales are soaring. The BIVB is reporting that sales are slightly higher now in 2022 than the already very impressive pre-COVID period. So the demand is going up and up and up. So on that note, what I'll say is that increasing demand will require increasingly larger pockets, and that should raise the interest in the secondary market for burgophiles, which should lead to increasing interest in sites like Wineauctionprices.com. So there's always a silver lining. Thank you very much for your time and interest. And in the 2021 vintage, it was a big ride for winemakers. I think it's going to be a big ride for them to sell the wines throughout the chain, and especially for consumers to buy them, to decide what they're going to buy. and whether they're going to buy it and at what prices. I will be back in Burgundy again in July, possibly September, and October, November of this year. Back to more of my regular schedule. I will tell you that if you are interested in purchasing in 2020s, I highly recommend them. Little pitch here, but you can take a look at my 125-page Burgundy special report on Tim Atkin's site. Tim is an MW and a journalist in the UK. Lots of tasting notes, so many tasting notes, and lots of tips on what to expect from that vintage as they do finally come into our market. Again, thank you. It's been a pleasure to have the opportunity to present to you at Grand Marquis Trading and wineauctionprices.com. See you soon.